Hey there, so a while ago I tested the Intel Arc A380, and I tested it with my Intel Pentium G7400 CPU, a 2-core, 4-thread CPU, which is on the LGA 1700 socket. It's a pretty good CPU, but it's not ideal for benchmarking higher-end-ish graphics cards like the Intel Arc A380. And a lot of you pointed out that I probably could get a lot more performance if I paired it with a faster CPU. So that's exactly what I did. I went out and bought myself a Intel i5-13400F, which is a 10-core, 16-threaded CPU, and it should go over and blow the socks off of the Intel Pentium G7400. And in terms of the performance of the Intel Arc A380, well, that's what I'm here to find out today. If it actually improves the performance, or if it's just the same. I also need to note, when I was testing the Pentium, I was using the new drivers, except those drivers are now 4 months old, and now that I'm testing it with the i5, I'm also using the new drivers, so there is 4 months of driver updates between the two tests, which can greatly change the results. So with Apex Legends, I am picking the low settings. The reason why is on the medium settings, it does actually drop from 60 frames per second at 1080p. And at the low settings, the game was running at an average frame rate of roughly 80, with a 1% low of 63. And how the Pentium handled it with the Intel Arc is it got 70 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 58. So the 1% low was about the same, and the average frame rate was 10 less. Though I do need to note, on the medium settings, for some reason I was only getting 60 frames per second on average with the i5, and with the Pentium I was getting 70 frames per second, and with the i5 it was also more stuttery. So I would blame that on drivers, though that would mean the drivers went in reverse and got worse, which I don't exactly think happened. Arc Survival Evolved at 1080p on the medium settings got 56 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 45 frames per second on average with the Pentium, and with the i5 it got 50 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 7. And it had a lot more stutters, so the average frame rate was lower, as well as the 1% lows were tremendously lower. Battlebit Remastered was not out when I tested the Intel Arc A380 last time, but this time I got to try it out, and at 1080p on the Ultra settings it got 130 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 75. So a perfect result. And if you wanted, you could probably slap this up to 4K and still get a 60 plus frame per second experience at Ultra settings. BeamNG Drive at 1080p on the medium settings with the low textures was running at roughly 53 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of roughly 36, which is actually identical to the Pentium within the margin of error. Now, one thing to note, for some reason with both CPUs the game was stuttering every roughly 5 seconds. It wasn't a big stutter, but you can definitely see it on the frame time graph. But one way or another, the game is perfectly playable, and if those frame time graph spikes are bugging you, you can always go over and cap the frame rate to, let's say, 45, and the game will not drop a single frame, no matter where you are on that map. Call of Duty Warzone 2.0 with FSR set to quality and on the minimum settings. Both of them got 57 frames per second on average, though there is one big notable note. And that is, when I tested the Pentium, it was on a deserty type map. And for some reason, I guess the map changed or something, and now it is a not deserty map, so I don't know if that affects the performance all that much, but that is something to take into account. CSGO at 1080p on the very low settings was running at 300 frames per second on average on the i5, and on the Pentium, well, I didn't test 1080p, I tested 1440p, and it was getting roughly 182 frames per second. And in both situations it was GPU bound, though it was barely GPU bound with the Pentium, so you could probably expect about the same frame rate, 182, even if it was 1080p. So by swapping out the Pentium for the i5, we gained around 100 frames per second in CSGO on the very low settings. New World at 1080p on the low settings was running at roughly 37 frames per second on average with the i5, with a 1% low of 7 frames per second. For context, the Pentium got 30 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 0. Yes, 0. Yeah, so that is a quite nice improvement, but the game is still not very well optimized and it still performed quite badly, but it is definitely playable. PUBG at 1080p on the very low settings was running at 76 frames per second on average on the i5 with a 1% low of roughly 55. There were some stutters that were notable, but not that many. And when it comes to the performance on the Pentium, well, I didn't test 1080p on the Pentium, I tested 1440p. And at 1440p it got 65 frames per second, but again I didn't test 1080p, so there's not really much to compare from. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p on the low settings with FSR set to balanced was getting 45 frames per second on average on the i5 with a 1% low of 37. And on the Pentium it was getting roughly 30 frames per second on average with a 1% low of around 15. So, a quite nice improvement with the i5, as expected for this game because it is actually quite CPU intensive. But still, not the best result, but still not bad either. BioShock Infinite at 1080p on the very high settings was getting roughly 85 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 75 frames per second on average. So all out, it is a fabulous experience. And when it comes to the Pentium, I'm not sure. The reason why is I tested it at 1440p and not 1080p, and I also tested it at the ultra settings and not the very high settings. But overall, the performance was very good. Borderlands 3 at 1080p on the medium settings on the i5, it got 45 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 32. And the Pentium got 45 frames per second on average, so identical, but the 1% lows were 10. So it got quite a lot higher average frame rate, 1% lows, the i5 got a lot higher 1% lows. Though, the thing is, it was still stuttery. I still had humongous stutters when I went over and walked around the map. So, neither experience was great, but the i5 was definitely a slightly better experience. Fortnite at 1080p on the medium settings is an interesting one. So, the i5 got 52 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 42. And the Pentium got 57 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 25. So the 1% low is the half with the Pentium, alright, so the i5 doubled the 1% low, though the average frame rate is actually less. It is 5 frames per second less, so slightly larger than a margin of error. Though this is also a completely different map. This map has jungly stuff on it, and the other one that I tested was not jungly at all. For the best frame rate, I would say the low settings would be the best option. The reason why is performance mode was an absolute stuttery mess. Shadow of the Tomb Raider's benchmark with the medium settings and XESS set to ultra quality got 43 frames per second on average. And when it comes to the Pentium, I had XESS set to quality and it got 46 frames per second on average. And the GPU was 100% bound on the i5 and 96% bound on the Pentium. So overall, I would say the Shadow of the Tomb Raider results are about identical between the two CPUs. Also, here are the results for the Cinebench R23 benchmark. Yeah, the i5 does definitely go over and blow the socks off the Intel Pentium. But the Intel Pentium, when it comes to gaming, it doesn't really hold back the Intel Arc A380 all that much. Some games do definitely benefit from the faster i5, but most of the games are relatively the same. It's hard to tell the difference. So if you have this Intel Pentium CPU and you want a Intel Arc graphics card, I would just go ahead and get the Intel Arc graphics card. You aren't going to be holding it back that much by having a Pentium. Either way, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you again in the next one. Also, I was on vacation to Florida. That's why I haven't been making any videos. Until now.